just like to welcome you here on behalf of Regent College. We wish we could be hosting you at the college, but we've got a lot of renovations happening, so it's turned upside down, and unfortunately we're not able to do that, but we're very grateful to the people at University Chapel for giving us the space for today, and thank you all for coming as well to this lunchtime event. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam people. Welcome again.
So I also welcome from the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation. My name is Arnold Sikama. I'm a physics professor at Trinity Western University, but I'm also the executive director of the CSCA, and this is a CSCA event co-sponsored with Regent College's MALTS program, and I'm the moderator for our panel discussion. At the end of our whole time, we will have a reception. There's coffee and tea and cookies and materials about CSCA and about MALTS in various places, and so we encourage people to stick around and chat with each of us at that point. So our topic today is leading for sustainability, environmental, economic, and theological perspectives. And this all came about because of two things. One is that I had heard that Martin was going to be in town, and I heard that Janel was going to be in town. So I will introduce the panelists and in order that are seated here. And I have a number of questions that I've come up with, and we'll see where the conversation goes. No one has any prepared remarks as far as I can tell, except for myself, because I have some questions that I've prepared. Sustainability is not my field. I'm a physics professor, but it's of great interest for a lot of us. So our panelists are Martin DeWitt, who's a professor of environmental governance at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and he has a master's from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and a doctorate from the University of Pretoria, and he did a master's at Regent College around a decade ago. And he's currently a scholar in residence for this semester at Regent College. He's on the board of directors at Arosha, South Africa, and his research is in the care for creation, interactions between the economy and the environment, and the place of the human person in environmental governance and social order. And he's has a book coming out very soon in Afrikaans on creation care and the interpretation of biblical texts on humanity's relationship to the natural environment. And that's the topic of his public lecture tonight at Trinity Western at 7 p.m. And then we have David Robinson, who's an assistant professor of marketplace theology and leadership at Regent College. And he has a PhD in theology from the University of Edinburgh. And he directs the MALTS program, Master of Arts in Leadership, Theology, and Society at Regent College. And his research is in the theological ethics of work and approaches to sustainability. And then at the end, we have Janel Curry, who's president of the American Scientific Affiliation, which is sort of the mother organization of the CSCA. The Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation is the Canadian expression of the American Scientific Affiliation. And I've worked closely with Janel for the past few years, as she's been the executive director and now president of the American Scientific Affiliation. She has a PhD in geography from the University of Minnesota. She has taught at Calvin University and Central College, and she has had administrative roles at Calvin as well as at Gordon College, and her research is in environmental policy and in religious worldviews and the environment, as well as women in leadership. So our topic tonight, or this noon, is leading for sustainability, environmental, economic, and theological perspectives. And I hope that from the bios you can tell that we have some experts here from various parts of the world who have thought about these topics, and I'm really looking forward to their remarks. So to get us going, there's a wide spectrum of engagement, both within each of the various religious communities that exist, as well as the wider public, with questions of environmental and economic sustainability, and indeed of humanity's place within the world generally. So how do we respond to such a spectrum of views that exist both in the church and other religions, as well as the wider public? And how do we forge an approach that's productive and not alarmist or apathetic to these things? We could probably talk about that for the whole time, but I'd like each panelist to just give perhaps some brief remarks about that and any other words of introduction that you'd like to give. We'll start with Martin.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Arnold, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a really big question. I think sustainability is one of those things which resist to being pinned down. There are definitions out there, and every time you open another textbook, another field is another definition. So I think to start with that is the acknowledgement that the field of sustainability is a wide concept. It's not so much a science in itself, although there are certain strands of sustainability science, but they come from a natural science perspective. I'm a trained economist, and a trained theologian, so we come from a different perspective. So I think that's the first thing, is to take an examination of sustainability in the broad field to start with. Now the second one is what's coming with that is the fact that we don't demonize another person's perspective. You take a relational approach to it. My most productive work that I've done in the last 20, 25 years is with people outside my own discipline. It's not that they don't like economists. It's just that these people bring a lot of great perspectives. Ecologists, biologists, people that understand their field, they understand the ecosystems in a way that I don't. And I understand the economy a little bit better than they do. So we can come together. It takes a bit of intellectual humility and a little bit of professional honesty, in a sense, to stand back and let somebody else speak as well. And then build a shared model. And that's basically, when I look back at my career so far, that was the most productive moments in working in this field. And then methodologically, also to bring theology into that, is that it's an interplay between things that are imminent, things that we experience in the world, our practicalities, but it's also an interplay with things that have transcendental value, transcendental norms. And if there's space for that kind of discussion all the time, it's a dialogue. But it's a dialogue with an objective of reaching something beyond ourselves. Sustainability pushes us beyond ourselves because it's so big that these things open up a discussion. You might call it metaphysics. I would love to call it God, theology. There's something out there which is much bigger than ourselves, and that needs to be filled in. Thank you.
David, what do you think in response to that first question, and any other introductory remarks?
Great. So I would go with a rough definition of sustainability as a measure of whether and how a given institution or activity can endure. So this is about going on. And I try to approach that in three interrelated ways and try not to make trade-offs between them where possible. So the first would be environmental, and we're most familiar with sustainability in terms of thinking of the environment. The global climate strike happened recently. We had high school students coming in from out of town, carrying signs saying, "I'm studying for a future that is being destroyed." And so there's a lot of concern over the state of the environment. And so we're asking, how can we pass on a healthy, livable environment to the coming generations? So the environmental aspect of sustainability. Second would be corporate interest in sustainability. So how can our institutions endure? And sometimes when it comes to business, one might feel that there's a trade-off between profitability and environmental concern. And I think the most exciting work in this area are people who are refusing that trade-off and saying, no, in fact, there's a new competitive environment. Sustainability is part of that. And one can make the argument that profitability requires attention to this. So the corporate or business aspect of this. And finally, the personal aspect of this, which is to say, how can I go the long run in my career? Questions of burnout are live in terms of some of the punishing work schedules that are out there, and one can do that even with respect to a good cause like sustainability. So how also are we thinking about employee health and longevity in their careers as we go? And our current seminar at Regent, we're taking the three aspects together, the environmental, the corporate, and the personal worker. And then what we're doing is casting that within a theological frame. So there's lots of space for alliances with different groups on those three aspects of sustainability. But as a theologian myself, my interest is in how God's own providential work, especially the sustaining of creation. So often providence is understood to be governing or accompanying or concurrence with human action, and those are both aspects of it. But the sustaining of creation and God's interest in life enduring is something that I want to call attention to as well.
Janel.
I think I bring a few different lenses to this out of my experience. First of all, as a geographer, we're usually interested in what this means on the ground, like in people's lives and especially community levels. But then also I come with mediation background as well, and also as a college administrator who's thinking about institutional change. So, and probably one other is I've done some work in New Zealand where they actually define sustainability as economic, social, environmental, but also cultural. So in many ways, I agree, sustainability is hard to define. So often what I end up going to is, what does flourishing look like? So that it has all those pieces together so that you're thinking of them as a whole. And often people can imagine that when they can't imagine sustainability, right? They know what health looks like. Healthy communities, healthy watersheds, people having jobs that don't make them work 24 hours a day. So it's that kind of vision, but also with a mediation background and emphasis on when you encounter somebody who is very different in their perspective of just, I would say, walking the watershed together and looking at things and asking questions, being inquisitive of the other person before you start to go down the discussion of what should you do. And so that listening, and I appreciate the comment about transparency on trade-offs, because I think that when you approach it in that way, you can be transparent as a community about the trade-offs, and in some ways it's pushing all those four elements forward at the same time, but it's almost like a dance to move it all forward. And I think in institutions too, so that I guess I'm always skeptical of extremes movements, because really you have to push all of them forward. And it's always incrementally, because you have to bring also the whole community with you as you move forward. So.
Thanks very much. I think we could probably keep on going on this conversation for a long time, but I have a few other questions. So the next question is about the concept of the cultural mandate. And so God as creator has made a world full of possibilities and built into creation so many wonderful resources for us to explore and to develop. In fact, many Christian traditions call that the cultural mandate that humanity has been given. In Genesis 1:26-28, we image bearers of God have been called to fill the earth and subdue it. So what is your view, and maybe we'll just rotate who starts, so maybe David can start this one here. What is your view of the cultural mandate, and how does it relate to questions of sustainability today? Maybe touch upon, has this responsibility been rightly understood historically? Have we perhaps now completed the cultural mandate? Is the earth now already full and subdued?
Great, thanks, Arnold. A lot to say about this. One thing, I work on theologies of work, and for the past while, there's been a lot of attention on Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And so what in theology we call protology, or first things. And this can go quite far. So cultural mandate is one way that this can be expressed, but you also get, for example, Michael Novak writing about business and writing about capitalism and saying that humans are co-creators with God. And so God created, but didn't finish the work, and humans are now in a situation of co-creation with God. And I think that goes a little too far. And I do think that Genesis 1 and 2 tend to be taken, well, you just mentioned Genesis 1, so it's worth noting Genesis 2, and I'll return to that in a moment. But we need to be sure we're always remembering Genesis 3, the fall, and the fact that the origins of cities and technology occur in Cain's line. And so there is a we want to be cautious about cultural mandate language if we're just reading Genesis 1 and 2 and taking that as a license to then co-create with God and so forth. The other thing to say briefly about that, again, is Genesis 1 was quoted, fill the earth and subdue, and the language of subdue is quite strong. I mean, this is used elsewhere of military conquest in the Bible, so Robert Alter translates this conquer. And I think there needs to be an honesty about the ways that the planet can sometimes be inimical to life. I mean, several mass extinction events happened before humanity came on the scene. The coronavirus pandemic has happened recently, so there are ways in which there needs to be human leadership in the world against these forces that work against life. So I think that needs to be honestly named. But we need to read Genesis 1 always with respect to Genesis 2. There are two accounts, and Genesis 2 uses the language of working the land and keeping or guarding it. And so there is this concern with a very close relationship to the earth. Obviously, the creation of humanity is expressed in terms of God breathing life in, and there's this much closer attention. So Genesis 1, with the language of fill and subdue and have dominion, and Genesis 2, the tilling and keeping need to always be kept together as we approach the environment. So there's more to say about that and cultural mandate discussion specifically, as well as stewardship language, which I find often to be imposed on Genesis 1 and 2 because the terms aren't used there. I think it's kind of taken from Jesus's parables and probably superimposed. So I would resist the language of stewardship for Genesis 1 and 2, but that's a further conversation.
Janel.
Yeah, I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to speak to the biblical language so much, but I think the cultural mandate can look at it in terms of God calling us and telling us we have the capacity to understand. And so you think of the fallenness, and we have a capacity to pay attention to the creation and understand what's going on and come alongside to bring healing, so that we do have that capacity, and that's a role for us as opposed to being totally separate from it, but to be healers of it. And one of the authors that I've always appreciated is Wes Jackson, and he talks about how we should pay attention to the original materials. So in order to be a co-creator, you have to be attentive to what is there. And so I see that as part of the cultural mandate, is being attentive to the systems and what's there and coming alongside. And I suppose we always, because of the fall, we have to be humble in our understanding and tentative and careful in how we interfere with things, because we don't understand everything.
Martin, thoughts on the cultural mandate from you?
Yeah, I think David already mentioned the most important one I want to mention is that Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is together. You have to read that together. But I think the consequence of that is that often we go to the cultural mandate and then we almost take the cultural idea that we hallow ordinary production and consumption. So we make that reverent. So that is the actual goal, the telos of society is to improve the economy. Well, I hear that a lot. I'm an economist, I work with economists. That's not the goal of telos of society. That's not what it is. We made that. It's something that comes out of the cultural development after the Enlightenment. So that's one point. So in a way, we secularize this whole idea of cultural mandate and we proportion it to ourselves. So we make disconnect between the creator and the creature. The creature becomes the one who's basically deciding what's going to be in the mandate. We don't recognize the mandate. To fill and subdue, I think that is a really theological rich argument waiting to be unpacked. And I'll just quickly point to a few things. Genesis 1, indeed, fill and subdue, and you get the idea it's material, it's about population, it's about bringing bodies into the world, and we have to have as many as possible. That idea you also get to a sense in Genesis 9, after Noah is coming out of the ark. The first thing God tells him is go out, multiply. But there's already a bit of a subjugation of the rule idea. So the rule isn't go out and do whatever you like. You can do certain things, but the animals are going to be, they're going to be cross with you. They're not going to be your friends anymore. This is not the same thing anymore. And then it goes on. And then in Egypt, Israel is being told, you multiply and you do what I want. There's a blessing. Go out and go into the land Canaan. They go into the land Canaan, but the material multiplication is happening, and that's not what God intended. So at the end, they go in exile. Because something in this whole idea of cultural mandate was misunderstood. And then we start understanding what that means later in the Bible when Jesus Christ comes to earth and say, I am the one in whom everything is fulfilled. And then the end in Revelations, where it basically tells you that the earth will be filled and subdued when God comes to live with us. So is the earth filled and subdued? Not yet in that sense. Yeah, are there too many bodies on Earth? Next question, probably.
Nice segue, because I was actually, my next question was going to be about population growth. And we have, we've seen the growth of population significantly. We also see changes in population growth in industrialized nations where the population is actually shrinking except for immigration. We also have the understanding, I think, that if every person or every nation in the world would use resources at the rate that is used in North America per capita, then the Earth would very rapidly run out of everything that we have. We would have total collapse. So what challenges and possibilities do you see in this vein of population growth and finding ways to deal with the potential of total collapse in case everybody did what we did over here? Janelle, do you want to begin on that one?
As a geographer, I'm skeptical of the argument around carrying capacity that you've just made, just because it assumes, the scale. I mean, at what scale? What does it mean on the ground? You can't talk about, so if I consume less, it's not necessarily going to help somebody who is in poverty in Africa. There's a system behind it, and it depends on the scale. And then, as you saw in China, where they then reduced their population, it was based on the assumption that it was a closed system, that there was no interaction with other cultures and trade and things like that. So carrying capacity in terms of thinking of a set resource base is, I don't find to be a helpful concept, and an economist probably wouldn't find it either, because resources are created by human intention. Things that we don't think are resources today can become a resource in a particular situation. So it's just much more complicated, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about our consumption at all. But it's much more complicated, and I think it's more helpful to think about, again, I'll go back to, what does a good life look like? And it doesn't, from my perspective, look like rampant consumption. That does not lead to flourishing. So that's a better argument for living in a different way. It's better to live with neighbors close by. It's better to have a richer life. Eat locally because you have a relationship with the farmers, and there are all kinds of things that feed into that.
Mm-hmm. Martin, any thoughts on population growth and carrying capacity?
Yeah, I think it's almost a category of wisdom. There's no hard and clear rules on this, and we should not even look for it, not even theologically. This is the field of wisdom, and wisdom means you have to weigh all the facts. And I agree with Janel on this. Population growth and social engineering and trying to curb that doesn't work. What we see in Europe, for instance, is the graying of populations with massive socioeconomic consequences. It's pension systems that cannot pay out anymore. Healthcare systems are falling apart because there's not enough finance from the younger generations to sustain all these old people. Yeah. Now, there needs to be a balance. Now, that balance, China obviously tried to remedy in another way, but that's creating also other imbalances in the system. So what I see as an economist, those work that we've done on looking at the variation of statistics, what are the most important drivers? It's mainly correlated to GDP, which GDP is gross domestic product, which is a measure of income. And that correlates with environmental impact, and especially energy use, much more clearly than population growth does. So that's for me one key point. It's about what we have and the kind of income that we apportion to each individual in society, which is much more important driver for sustainability than the amount of bodies on Earth. That's the one first. Not the amount of bodies is not important, but this is the most important driver. So that's where you will start changing the system. So you look for levers in the system where you get the most bang for your buck, in a sense. Then on carrying capacity, I agree, it's not a fixed and static concept, it's very fluid. It's contingent on technology, it's contingent on knowledge and innovation, it's contingent on entrepreneurship. Things change all the time. And there's an open system, as long as there's solar radiation, we can change. So don't close the system, don't close hope, not even material hope. Because there is a sun that's shining, let's use it. Use it properly. So
the sun has about another 4.5 billion years, we're told. So
it's probably outlive us. Yeah. So I think that there is something to be said about the scale of intensity of our action in terms of population and the economy, and indicators on that is important. Not to only look at GDP or energy use, but the scale of intensity, and that is the environmental effects that's been caused by our actions. Is that toxic? Then reduce that very quickly. Is it causing systems-wide problems like microplastics? We have to really pay serious attention because things can flip the other way. Systems are flipping. The tipping points, and some ecologists call that. And the measure of that is resilience. And resilience is on economy scale, nation scale, global scale, but also really on community scale. How resilient are we to change? That to me is a much better concept to think about creating sustainable societies and communities.
David, thoughts on population growth and carrying capacity and challenges and possibilities?
Yes, just with respect to what you asked earlier about filling and subduing and the extent of the human mark on the earth. If you haven't seen it yet, Edward Bertinsky is a Canadian photographer who's done some large-scale photography of factories, of waste. He's got a project called the Anthropocene Project, which just gives us a good visual take on the extent of human modification of environments. So I recommend his work to you. With respect to population, I defer to these two. The person who's often referenced on this is Thomas Malthus and the essay on population from the 18th century, and this was an influence on Darwin. And he had quite a progressive father who was interested in the perfectibility of human society, and he wanted to say, look, population is going to increase, arable land and the production of food and so forth is not going to match it. Now that's been challenged, rightly, but today I think it's worth sounding those cautionary notes sometimes when it comes to availability of fresh water or other resources, and indeed paying attention to some of the tipping points that Martin referenced as well. So I think that Malthus is paternalistic about people having children and not having children and so forth, so I think we want to avoid that, but we also do want to exercise wisdom with the families we have and so forth.
So my next question is about institutions and individuals. So I think thinking about many different contexts, you have people who have composted and recycled in their own homes. They move into an apartment building. You can't do that in the apartment building. You have people who work at a large university, and the university may not have the larger processes that you are comfortable with and you want to do. So individuals are often far ahead of institutions. Of course, institutions are made of individuals. So I was wondering, Martin, how do you think we can address this imbalance? How do individuals influence institutions and towards sustainability?
Yeah, I think it's the interplay between the two. It's individuals and institutions. And maybe just the definition of institution I hold as the rules of the game rather than organizations. So there are organizations and they're also an institution. It's an institution to have a 4PNT as well, where people come together. It's a community kind of institution. So that's what I think about institutions. The usual response to sustainability and individuals and institutions is to change incentives so that individuals can get up to a particular institutional standard. So the incentives are either through changing behavior or through carbon taxes or anything like that. So we want to change your behavior towards a stated good, which is usually a government-led or regulatory-led kind of incentive. Now, the other way of changing systems is to take it as a moral problem. Say, well, the institutions that's got everything to do with uplifting morality in society, that's their problem. They have to preach better and educate people better and have all sorts of school systems, education systems. That's also institutions. And then the third one is the structural change in institutions that are needed. And I think that's probably where I want to go a little bit, because structural change in institutions that are needed means that individuals on themselves, whatever's happening on the economic sphere or the morality sphere, is not going to change things to that level. Just one example, the top 100 companies in this world is responsible for about 60 to 70% of carbon dioxide. That's not something that individuals can sort out. That needs to be sorted out on a different level. It's a government business construct. So the institution of government business coming together and sorting this out is much more important than every individual. Yes, it's very important that every individual does whatever he can or she can, but not on that level. So the institutions, there's a responsibility of governance. It's not only about individual change. And the narrative sometimes, I think, is going a little bit too far and offloading the problem to the individual. It's not the case. I don't think so. It's much more on a systems-wide level. And it can be addressed by certain institutional linkages.
David, you're a professor of leadership at Regent, and leadership is important in terms of institutions and individuals as well. So do you have thoughts on that?
Absolutely, yes, thank you. So I think I mentioned earlier the not making the trade-off when it comes to business between sustainability and profitability. Profitability is how businesses endure, of course. That's a key of their own sustainability. There are a lot of ways we can look at what successful institutions have done on this front. So someone I've appreciated is Chris Laszlo. He's got a few books on embedding sustainability within organizations. And his book, Sustainable Value, starts with a long management fable of a CEO who comes to become convinced that sustainability is important for the organization and then goes about convincing her team how to do that. So half of the book is spent on a really detailed account of this. That would be one example. And then he goes through a number of mainstream companies who've done this and the ways that they've gone about that. So there's good material out there, both in terms of more contemporary examples as well as historic examples, both cautions and successes of people who've tried to exercise corporate stewardship with respect to the environment and with respect to human and worker health. The other thing I just wanted to mention was with respect to, it's not with respect to the individual necessarily, but when it comes to the carbon tax, we see how resistant people are, and there's now been a multi-party turn against it, to bearing the costs for environmental damage. And so I think we need to also look at ourselves and say, are we willing to spend a bit more to get the Marine Stewardship Council label on that can of tuna, or the B Corporation logo on the tea that I buy, or something like that. So there is a question of consumption, but also investment, I think, is a big point on this. Christy Stevenson, who's director of the Ethics Center at Sauder School of Business here, has spoken at Regent a couple times, and she works on investment with respect to ESGI criteria. And that's obviously a complex topic, and I think, we need to get standards up on that. But nevertheless, the idea of our investments also reflecting our ethical values, and are we supporting the companies that are taking risks sometimes to embed sustainability within them, both in terms of our consumption habits or what we're buying, but also what our investment dollars go towards. So I think that's an important question to ask as well.
David, I was wondering what ESGI is. I think I put together a couple of possibilities. What you mentioning?
Oh, sure. So when it comes to investing, you can filter for companies based on environmental criteria, social criteria, so how they're engaging with stakeholders, and governance criteria as well. And then the I in Canada is for Indigenous engagement as well. So that's something that I know Christy Stevenson and her work has seen as very important.
Okay, thanks. Janelle.
In some ways, I agree, everything before, because I do think that individuals do things, but you have to have the incentives, the structures in place to incentivize. So that's like with the carbon tax, we need it because it tells you what the cost is for your behavior. And so I've become more fascinated with the question of what we measure. And a way of social change is making sure that we measure what signals what we should do, right? And if you can structure those into institutions, it helps give the information to the structures to start to change. So that just getting the incentives correct, and sometimes that's very hard with the special interests at the political level. But I see that as embedding information in structures. So more of the processes you have in an institution that embed the regular collection of information that tells you how you're doing, the more likely you are to get change in that institution, and it signals for those on the ground what the correct behaviors are.
So this is my last question for the panel, but I'm going to, after the panelists have answer this question, I'm going to invite the questions and answers, or questions from the audience as well. You can direct them to any of the individuals, or in fact the whole institution of the panel here. So just this past Monday, we had Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And ever since the 2015 report of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there will be a growth in reflection about European and other settlers occupying traditionally ancestral unceded territories of Indigenous peoples, including in land acknowledgements. We had a land acknowledgement here at the beginning of this event as well. And the concept of stewardship, which I think, David, you already mentioned a bit earlier, is growing in popularity even outside of faith communities. While that's happening, there's still within Christian circles, it's quite popular to be thinking about sovereignty over privately owned property. How do you assess this situation, and can you suggest a fruitful way forward? And actually, before I let you answer that, I also wouldn't mind including a reflection, because we have 3 different countries represented. South Africa would have had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some kind as well, also with respect to Indigenous peoples. The US has not, as far as I know. And so perhaps the context of these countries is different in terms of how stewardship is thought of, popularly and also within religious circles, and how private property is thought of as well. I don't know, I think, David, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, as a Canadian, sure.
Yeah.
So one of the calls to action coming out of the TRC, I think it's 92, is addressed to the corporate sector and is about business thinking about development and the importance of both the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and free and informed consent with those peoples whose land it is, on pursuing development projects, as well as equitable access to the corporate sector and so forth. So you can read the full call to action, but definitely business is a part of reconciliation in this view. On a personal side, there's a lot that we can learn about the earth we inhabit from our Indigenous neighbors, Indigenous brothers and sisters in the Christian faith. For myself, I've learned a lot from Ray Aldred, who's a Cree theologian and director of the Indigenous Studies program at BST. And I remember asking him once, because I'd been at an ethics conference where someone was talking about the earth as traumatized and the need for human care of the earth and so forth. And he just said, the earth is our mother. She cares for us. You know, there's this overweening human, paternalism almost about the earth sometimes. And he was able to reframe that for me. Also, his thinking to the 7th generation, that idea of intergenerational ethics. So there's a great deal I think we can learn on this front. You mentioned unceded territory. I come from an area where there is a treaty, so numbered treaties in the Prairie provinces, and so relationships will look different in BC as they will in Saskatchewan, but I think that the imperative of reconciliation is clear, and it can happen through business. It also happens with faith communities. And I think as well in the sciences, the need for Indigenous wisdom and the sciences to be in conversation.
Mm-hmm. Janel, thoughts from you?
Yeah, from the United States perspective, we have the challenge of a constitution and a whole legal structure that so prioritizes individual rights that it's very difficult. So individual rights and property rights. So I might just talk about the sort of the structure in New Zealand, which I found to be meaningful, because there they have the Maori people who have actually maintained stewardship rights over areas where they may not own the land. So it's a way of responsibilities being the emphasis rather than the rights of ownership. And the concept there is your mana, or your authority increases with the flourishing of that area you have responsibility for. So I really think that for the United States, we need a whole different way of looking at things, because the individual property rights is so embedded in the culture that there's almost no room to to even think of other ways of envisioning the responsibilities towards indigenous peoples and the land.
Martin.
Yeah, so Africa, the land question is still a very vexed question. The latest I've seen is this Expropriation Without Compensation Act, which obviously throws the toilet out of the cot for a lot of people. It's what I'm still sure of. If it's still my property, can it be defended in court? All those questions, you can imagine. Mm-hmm. So it's a very vexed political question, and it's now in the political party's domain to fight this out, unfortunately. With the fact that a lot of land has not been compensated. There has not been a lot of progress on that front. It's not my area of study, so I don't know exactly what's going to happen in the next so many years, but that's where we're heading at this point. I think stewardship is usually being interpreted, at least in the literature I've seen, through the lens of the fact that private property is a given, and then if it's a Christian stewardship idea, then God asks us to look after our private property in such a way that we glorify Him. But in the process, we also have a lot of benefits for ourselves. Now there's a history to this, and if we look back at the economic history, it comes with the ideas of John Locke and before him, which private property basically became private property the moment labor was expended on it. So if there's an apple tree which belongs to everyone in the communage, the apples become yours the moment you start picking them up. That was basically his idea, because he still believed the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. We see this Psalm 24 verse 1. But he said, if it's still the Lord's, but it becomes yours when you put labor into it. And we also have some scriptural support for that. But then the labor idea, which became a classical economic idea, sort of filtered through the system, and capital was included in that. When capital became the force of the economy, not labor so much anymore. So then capital, and whatever you can do with capital, if you put capital in it, it's yours. So you can buy it. And then the legal system obviously supported these ideas, and it became a given. I mean, in the North American context, it's the given. That's the Constitution. That's where you start. Not so much in African economies. That's where you still have both tussling it out. So you have this Roman Dutch law import in Africa, and you have this indigenous law, which is more about communage and tribal systems of apportioning property that's fighting itself out. It's two different systems with two different histories. So there's no easy solution to this. I think it becomes a problem if it's called natural law equals private property, because that is not a natural law. That's something which is an historic construct. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all the panelists for restraining yourselves and only speaking a few minutes at a time. Each of you could probably give an hour-long lecture on each of the questions I've asked. So I now invite folks in the audience. We have about 10 minutes for people to ask some questions, and you could direct your question to one or two or all of them, but try to make your questions succinct and see if we can have a number of questions answered. And we're ending at about 3 minutes before 1 for some closing remarks. So, Cliff.
Well, this is maybe a good follow-up to just what you were talking about with private property. I wonder if any of you have read or you're familiar with Earth for All report to the Club of Rome from 2022. Not familiar. Emphasizing the need to have some eco-socialist. Actually, that's the only way they see hope for the world, is to view the world as Earth for All, which is pretty much a repudiation of capitalism. Mm-hmm. So I'm making those general terms. I know a lot of what we've been talking about here, and a lot of what we talk about generally is kind of tweaking our capitalist systems, and I'm not sure we're going to get there that way. This book gave me a lot of hope, but I'm not clear that these are the best solutions or that they're even possible. But I wonder if you have any responses to more of a socialist or an eco-socialist response worldwide to the environmental problem.
I think always the question for me is the scale at which it's operationalized, that concept is operationalized, because like Martin's description in South Africa, there's more possibility of dialogue between private property and indigenous systems in the United States, the legal structure it would be very difficult to move in that direction. So I think in every context, you have to work within that legal system or that structure and figure out creative ways to move it in that direction. So I'm not sure at a global scale the concept is workable. It is, how do you do it within each country?
And everyone else on the panel has made a note of the book that you referred to, and they're going to go and read it. Other questions, or anyone else that want to respond further to the question? Yes, Mark, and then I guess we have a few others. So,
Hi, I have a friend in politics in Alberta, but he does accept vaccines and evolution, but we disagree a little on climate, and what he'll often say is he has this concept of political entropy. And he talks about how there's some things that you'd like to do, but you can never, it's just not possible to do them without losing other things. And he says, a carbon tax might look really good on paper, but it's not sustainable as a political offering because too many people hate it too much of the time. And so it can never do what we need it to do because of the people. And I guess I'm just wondering what you think of that idea and what I might say to my friend. So.
I think, David, you talked about the carbon tax in one of the responses.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this has to do with the wisdom of how these things are rolled out and the political, capital when it spends and so forth. And so I thought that Andrew Coyne had a good column in the Globe and Mail recently about this and saying that he sees it as a superior economic policy, but also recognizes how the Liberal Party has done with it and now it's being attacked and even abandoned on the left a bit. So I think that there's a lot to do with the way it works politically. I don't think that political entropy is some kind of destiny for it. I think that it can be done better, and I hope it will be done better. But currently, we're in this moment, I think, partly because of the way things were rolled out, the way they were unevenly done, the way things were communicated, and those are all aspects of political leadership that should have been done better and hopefully will be done better in the future.
One aspect of that is also the question about the recycling of the carbon tax revenue. Where does that go?
Yeah, that's right.
And that becomes a problem because it's only a tax. It adds to the cost of the economy. But where does the tax go? Is it going back into some green shoots? Is it going back into care? Where's this money going? And that usually is not communicated well. So it's only adding to the cost, but it's not. It's basically, the economists call it, we internalize the externality. So if there's an external cost, we put a tax on it so the behavior will change, but that money you earn in the process need to go back into the economy, into good things. And that part is usually not communicated well, although it's part of the initial design. And I'm sure that people who studied that before they bring this as a policy option has done that work, but it hasn't come back to the voter, which is an unfortunate political thing.
Other questions? I saw a couple hands earlier in the back there.
Yeah, just want to say thank you for all three of you for your time this afternoon. My question pertains to something that is, I think, deeply felt here in Vancouver, which is urban housing issues. But it's a problem that, to my mind at least, brings together, David, what you said about environmental sustainability, corporate sustainability, and individual personal sustainability. I'm a part-time sort of lecturer at Regent and also a pastor here in Vancouver. So I'm really curious about how kind of small to medium nonprofits, I'm thinking about churches and smaller organizations, how they could be engaged in a housing crisis issue, not just here in Vancouver, but urban areas around the world.
I don't live in Vancouver, so the level at which we feel housing issues in Michigan it's there, but I'm just saying I understand that you're talking at a whole different scale, but we do have groups that are buying up land to build in houses that the land stays in a trust. And then there are restrictions in terms of the selling of the houses and the cost to try to reduce the cost and try to change the structure of the property rights and it goes with the deed. So looking for creative solutions that way that build communities, and so those are the ones that we're looking at anyway, where I am. And it's faith-based groups that are doing this.
And just this is, I mean, I teach in marketplace theology, and one of our emphases is to think about the church deployed and not just the church gathered, right? And so to really think about how you can be supporting those who are working in policy leadership and so forth that might be a part of your community or might be in the parish, even if not part of your gathered congregation, and thinking about how you can work with and equip them and also learn from them, because you don't want the church to have the sense that it's got to go it alone and focus on, building housing on their own lot and so forth. I mean, that can be one solution, and I know churches that have done that, but I think marketplace theology has us think more broadly about the people of God and think about them in positions of considerable leadership, and finding out how we can support them and encourage them that their work is a form of ministry, as it were, or a form of theological service in the world.
I believe Gordon had a question as well, and then maybe our last question, and then I'll have some closing remarks.
So it's the whole thing of economy and ecology, and the serendipity between them, or the tensions between them. And so it seems to me that there's been a lot of research, a lot of work that's been done to move us forward in the relationship between economy and ecology. But how do we get the buy-in? How do we motivate people to move in some of these more positive directions, more cooperative, responsible ways of proceeding?
I can speak to that first. We're moving forward in a sense, but also we're recovering something that was lost. Margaret Chabas, who's in the philosophy department here, has written a book on the natural roots of the economy and goes through a process of the denaturalization of economics. And so if you think back to earlier notions, like if you look at someone like Martin Luther in the Reformation and how he would talk about the oikonomia and the household, right? I mean, work was very much embedded within household, within family, but also with connection to the land and so forth. So the idea of, I mean, you mentioned the common root, right, to economy and ecology, and that notion of house and keeping house. Mm-hmm. So I think that if you're in a faith community and you're wanting to make this case, you can often look back to figures in the faith. If you're in the Lutheran tradition, it could be Luther. If you're in the Calvinist tradition, you could look at Calvin, and you could look at people who didn't see these as separated out the way that we currently do in the modern disciplinary separation, although Martin could speak much more knowledgeably to that than I could.
I think picking up on that, I think the separation really started with Adam Smith and some of the classical economists in the 18th century, where they basically postulated that the action of individuals, whatever choices you make, will somehow lead to spontaneous, harmonious order through an invisible hand. And that invisible hand, they still believe was providence. So God was made immanent to it, and He will make sure that we will not breach the limits. So as long as we have the freedom of choice. Now there was pushback already, as you said, Thomas Malthus and some others immediately, and then Karl Marx on the labor issue. And that's now being picked up by the Club of Rome and ecological economists, and they're harking back to the classical economists of that time, say there are limits, and those limits are real and they're physical. And we need to take them into account. And I think the real fertile field which is happening now between economics is to recognize some of these biophysical limits and recognize the fact that humanity has got massive ingenuity and knowledge, and bring that together in different modeling perspectives. Mm-hmm. Now we do that at an academic level. To transfer that to the policy level is a long process. And usually that takes a lot of time, because in that process you have to deconstruct some of the received wisdom, if I call that, from economic sciences, mainstream economic sciences. And you have to put something new in place, which everybody can see is happening around us, but then give that a currency. So you need to give that a dollar cent value, because that's how financiers and bankers will get on board. And that there's languages for that, language of risk, language of insurance. These things it's coming back. The real world, the real biophysical world is coming back through these channels into the financial economy. It's not that it's completely new. So we use whatever tools there are in the existing economy and then enrich them with a view of a better way of seeing the integration between economics and ecology. And the most productive work is interdisciplinary, I think, on that score, between the disciplines.
That, I think where I'm most encouraged in, at least in the US situation, is that there's more creativity on the local and the state level than at the federal level. And so, you know, it's shown, that's where there seems to be more movement for this creativity to model things and then just see what's working and what isn't. So it's not just one solution, it's we have to learn what works.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for modeling that creativity and interdisciplinarity. And let's thank our panelists.